Have you ever met someone who seemed older than their years, carrying wisdom that didn't match their age? Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of the child who had to mature before their time, a story that might reveal parts of your own journey or someone you know. Sarah was only 8 years old when everything changed. The morning her father left without saying goodbye, she watched her mother collapse on the kitchen floor, sobbing uncontrollably. In that single moment, Sarah's childhood ended. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she walked over to her mother, placed a small hand on her shoulder, and said the words that would define her life. "It's okay, Mom. I'll take care of us." The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time begins with moments like these. Moments when responsibility crashes down like a tidal wave, when a young mind is forced to build adult bridges before learning to play childhood games. Sarah became the parent that morning. She learned to cook simple meals, to forge her mother's signature on school permission slips, to lie to teachers about why her homework wasn't done because she'd been up all night comforting her depressed mother. What happens inside the mind of a child who carries such weight? Psychologists call this phenomenon parentification, but the reality is far more complex than any clinical term can capture. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time involves a fundamental rewiring of neural pathways, a premature development of the prefrontal cortex responsible for decision making and emotional regulation. These children don't just grow up fast. They skip chapters entirely. By the time Sarah was 10, she had mastered the art of invisibility. At school, she smiled and pretended everything was normal. She learned that adults felt uncomfortable when children revealed too much pain, so she kept her struggles hidden behind a mask of maturity. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often includes this skill, this ability to read rooms, to sense what others need, to become whatever version of themselves makes everyone else comfortable. But what about what Sarah needed? What about her dreams, her fears, her simple desire to be a child? These questions got buried beneath layers of responsibility. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time creates a peculiar kind of grief, a mourning for a childhood that never existed. Sarah grieved while making breakfast. She grieved while paying bills with money she earned from babysitting. She grieved in the silence of her room, where no one could see. The human brain isn't designed to handle adult stress during childhood development. When a child experiences chronic responsibility and emotional burden, their stress response system becomes hyperactive. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time reveals elevated cortisol levels, a constant state of hypervigilance, and an inability to truly relax even in safe environments. Sarah's body was always preparing for the next crisis, the next emergency, the next moment when she would need to be the adult. Have you noticed these patterns in your own life or in someone close to you? The inability to ask for help, the compulsion to fix everyone else's problems, the feeling that relaxation is somehow irresponsible? These are hallmarks of the psychology of the child who had to mature before their time. As Sarah entered her teenage years, the consequences of her premature maturity became more apparent. While her peers were discovering themselves, making mistakes, testing boundaries, Sarah had no room for exploration. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often results in a truncated adolescence. Sarah had already been making life or death decisions, already been managing household finances, already been emotional support for her mother. What rebellion could compare to the responsibility she already carried? But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time isn't just about loss and trauma. It's also about extraordinary strength, resilience, and capability. Sarah possessed emotional intelligence that took most people decades to develop. She could read subtle social cues, anticipate needs before they were spoken, and navigate complex emotional landscapes with remarkable skill. However, this strength came at a cost. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time creates what therapists call a competency trap. Sarah became so good at being responsible, so skilled at managing crisis, that she couldn't stop, even when her mother eventually recovered. Even when emergencies ended, Sarah couldn't return to being a child. Her identity had been forged in the fire of premature responsibility. When Sarah went to college, she struggled in ways her peers couldn't understand. While they complained about homesickness or difficult classes, Sarah was experiencing something different. For the first time in her life, no one needed her to be the adult. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often includes this disorienting sense of purposelessness when the burden is finally lifted. Who was she if she wasn't taking care of someone? Sarah found herself drawn to other students who seemed lost, struggling, or overwhelmed. She became the unofficial therapist of her dormitory, the person everyone called in crisis. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time creates patterns that are incredibly difficult to break. Sarah was recreating the only dynamic she knew, the only role in which she felt valuable. Do you see yourself in these patterns? Have you ever felt more comfortable giving than receiving? More secure in chaos than in peace? These questions matter because the psychology of the child who had to mature before their time affects millions of people, many of whom never realize they're carrying this particular burden. The turning point came during Sarah's junior year. She was 20 years old, sitting in an introduction to psychology class, when the professor began discussing childhood development. As the professor described the stages of healthy emotional growth, Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that what happened to her wasn't normal. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time had been her entire reality for so long that she had never questioned whether it should have been different. That night, Sarah did something she hadn't done since she was 8 years old. She cried, not the silent, controlled tears she allowed herself in private moments, but deep, racking sobs that came from a place she had locked away for over a decade. She cried for the little girl who never got to be careless, who never got to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences, who never got to believe that someone else would catch her if she fell. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time includes this moment of recognition, this painful awakening to what was lost. But it also includes what comes after, the slow and difficult work of reclaiming pieces of the childhood that was stolen. Sarah began therapy, a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. In those sessions, she learned about boundaries, about the difference between helping and enabling, about the right to be imperfect and still worthy of love. The psychology of the child who had matured before their time can be understood, processed, and healed, but it requires acknowledgement. It requires looking directly at the pain instead of staying perpetually busy to avoid it. Her therapist introduced her to the concept of reparenting, the idea that adults can give themselves the care and protection they didn't receive as children. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often requires this kind of intentional healing work. Sarah started small. She gave herself permission to play, to be silly, to make mistakes without the world ending. She learned to recognize when she was slipping into caretaker mode and to consciously choose differently. But healing isn't linear, and the psychology of the child who had to mature before their time leaves deep imprints. Sarah still struggled with asking for help. She still felt guilty when she wasn't being productive. She still experienced anxiety when others tried to take care of her. These patterns have been carved into her psyche during crucial developmental years, and they didn't disappear just because she now understood them. What Sarah discovered, however, was that understanding itself was powerful. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time becomes less controlling when you can name it, when you can see it operating in your life. Sarah started noticing when she was taking on responsibility that wasn't hers, when she was sacrificing her needs for others not because it was necessary, but because it was familiar. She also began to appreciate the gifts that came from her experience. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time had given her extraordinary empathy, practical problem-solving skills, and emotional depth that enriched her relationships and her work. Sarah decided to become a therapist herself, specializing in childhood trauma and family dynamics. She wanted to help other children who were forced to grow up too fast, to give them support she never had. Now in her 30s, Sarah has built a life that honors both her strength and her vulnerability. She maintains healthy relationships where reciprocity is possible, where she can both give and receive. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time still shows up, still influences her choices and reactions, but it no longer controls her life. She has learned to be both the capable adult she became and the playful child she never got to be. What about her relationship with her mother? This is where the psychology of the child who had to mature before their time gets particularly complex. As adults, Sarah and her mother had to renegotiate their entire dynamic. Her mother, who had recovered from her depression years ago, carried tremendous guilt about what she had put Sarah through. Sarah had to work through anger she didn't know she had, resentment that had been buried under years of understanding and compassion. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often includes complicated feelings toward the adults who should have protected them but couldn't. Sarah loved her mother deeply, but she also mourned the childhood her mother's illness had taken from her. Both things could be true simultaneously. Healing required holding space for this complexity. Through family therapy, Sarah and her mother learned to have honest conversations about those difficult years. Her mother apologized, not just once but repeatedly, acknowledging the burden she had placed on her daughter. Sarah learned to express her anger and sadness without feeling like she was betraying her mother or being ungrateful. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time begins to heal when truth can be spoken and received with compassion. Today, Sarah works with children who remind her of herself. She sees them in her office, these small people carrying enormous weights, and she recognizes the signs immediately. The way they speak with careful precision, monitoring their words. The way they try to take care of her during sessions, asking if she needs anything. The way they minimize their own pain while maximizing everyone else's needs. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time is written all over them. But Sarah also sees something else. She sees resilience. She sees creativity in survival. She sees the beautiful and terrible truth that children are far more capable than we give them credit for, and that this capability comes at a tremendous cost. Her work is to honor both realities, to help these children carry their burdens more lightly, while also, slowly, helping them set some of those burdens down. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time is not a life sentence. It's a starting point, a context, a set of patterns that can be understood and transformed. Sarah's story is unique in its details, but universal in its themes. Around the world, in every culture and community, children are forced into premature maturity by circumstances beyond their control. Poverty, illness, addiction, death, divorce, war, these forces don't respect the developmental needs of children. What happens to these children as they grow? The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time follows them into adulthood in predictable ways. They often become high achievers, driven by an internalized belief that their worth depends on their usefulness. They struggle with intimate relationships because vulnerability feels dangerous. They experience anxiety and depression at higher rates than their peers. They have difficulty identifying and meeting their own needs because they learned early that their needs were secondary to survival. But they also bring extraordinary gifts to the world. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time produces some of our most compassionate leaders, innovative problem solvers, and dedicated healers. These adults understand suffering in ways that create deep empathy. They can navigate complexity and ambiguity because they've been doing it since childhood. They possess an unshakable core of strength because they've already survived what many adults fear most. The question isn't whether premature maturity causes damage. It does. The question is what we do with that damage, how we transform it, how we ensure that the next generation of children doesn't have to carry the same burdens. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time should inform how we structure support systems, how we intervene in families facing crisis, how we create safety nets that catch children before they have to become their own safety net. Sarah often thinks about the 8-year-old girl she was, standing in that kitchen, watching her mother fall apart. If she could go back, what would she tell that little girl? The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time includes this impulse, this desire to reach back through time and offer comfort. Sarah would tell her younger self that she was brave, that she did her best, that survival was enough. She would also tell her that none of it was her responsibility, that she deserved to be protected and cared for, that her childhood mattered. But since time travel isn't possible, Sarah does the next best thing. She tells the children in her office these truths. She creates a space where they can be both capable and vulnerable, both strong and in need of help. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time begins to shift when even one adult sees a child beneath the premature maturity and insists on protecting their right to be young. Think about the children in your life. Do any of them seem too mature, too responsible, too concerned with adult problems? The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time often goes unnoticed because these children are so good at managing. They don't cause trouble. They don't ask for help. They fly under the radar precisely because they've learned to take care of themselves. But underneath that competent exterior is a child who needs what all children need: safety, consistency, the freedom to make age-appropriate mistakes, and adults who can handle their own problems. What can we do differently? The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time teaches us that prevention is possible. When we support struggling parents before they break, when we provide resources for families in crisis, when we create communities where asking for help is normalized rather than stigmatized, we protect children from having to become adults before their time. Every intervention matters. Every support system we build is a childhood we might save. For those of you who recognize yourself in Sarah's story, know that it's never too late to begin healing. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time can be addressed at any age. Therapy, support groups, honest conversations, reparenting work. These tools exist and they work. The patterns you developed to survive your childhood made sense in that context, but you get to choose different patterns now. You get to reclaim pieces of the childhood you lost. You get to be both the strong person you became and the vulnerable person you never got to be. Have you experienced this in your own life? Do you recognize these patterns in yourself or someone you love? The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time is more common than most people realize. Breaking the silence around it, sharing our stories, and seeking support are crucial steps toward healing. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the psychology that shapes our lives. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes understanding where we've been is a first step toward choosing where we're going. The psychology of the child who had to mature before their time doesn't have to define your entire story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter, one where you finally get to be both strong and soft, both capable and cared for. Thank you for watching, and remember that your story matters, your healing matters, and you deserve all the support you never received as a child.